Bill here. I'd like to share with you some standard mating patterns in 3 moves that I've collected. Okay, in this one we'll start with a queen sacrifice, drawing the king into a discovered check. Now we give a double check, and then we have a rather neat mate with a knight and bishop. Now this time we start with a rook check. Now we have a double check, forcing the king to move, and we have a neat little mate with the rook. And when you look at that position, you think, how on earth did the white rook get into the corner? This time we have the bishop lined up on a pawn in the line of the king, defended by a rook. So we start off by deflecting that rook away. Now we can take that pawn check, rook box, and now we have a mate. Okay, so here we've got a relatively simple mate with the rook's checking on the back line, so the pawn helps to stop the king escaping. So we'll check, king moves across, we'll check again. Now we mate with the second rook. This is similar, except we're going in the other direction. So the rook's moving on the back line and move on the side. So check, check, and checkmate. And this is the same sort of thing, except this time the king's on a different square. Check, rook check, and mate. Now, when you've got 2 rooks on the 7th rank like this, if you have the square, the G7 square, guarded by anything at all, a bishop, a pawn, a knight or king, you'll have a forced mate. So we'll start with a rook check. We'll start with another rook check, and now we have mate on the back line. Okay, so bishop and rook attack the pawn, so we get a free pawn with check, forcing the king into a discovery. This check doesn't work. Other checks will allow the pawn to block, so the way to mate is move the rook to the back, and we mate on the file. Okay, now we want this square vacated for the bishop, so we'll sacrifice the knight. Bishop goes check. Now we have a mate. Okay, so we've got weak white squares, and the queen and bishop can force a mate, so we'll start with a check. If the king had gone up, it still would have been mate. We'll check on the back line. And now we've got check, mate. King is looking very open. Queen moves closer to the king with checks, closer again, and now mates. First of all, we'll start with a bishop check to force the king into the line of the queen. We'll give a discovered check. Now the bishop covers this square, we can mate with the queen. Okay, so superficially you'd think black looks safe. However, the queen checks, forces the bishop to block, and now we have a mate with a lone bishop coming up. We check. The queen is defended by X-ray. Bishop takes the bishop, mate. I first saw that in a Boys Owner annual from about 1927. Okay, so king's looking pretty open. We'll give a rook check. If the king had gone the other way, we would have had mate in 1. We give another check and mate. So we've got the open H file, and the pawn near the king makes this very vulnerable. We'll start with a rook check to gain time for the attack. The queen can join the attack with check, and now we have a mate. So king's looking a bit weak because it's the 7th rank is weak. Rook moves to the 7th rank with check. Queen moves closer to the king with check, and now I've got a mate either here or here. Mate. King's looking very open. This diagonal's open. The H-file is open. Rook gives check. Rook gives another check. And now we have mate with the queen. Here we have an unusual situation where two bishops force a mate. Bishop gives a check, forcing the king in the corner. Bishop gives another check. Now, either taking with the bishop or the pawn is mate. Now, something I pulled off in Lightning many years ago. So we start with a back rank check, forcing the king up. Knight gives a check. And the rook mates from behind with the double pawn, stopping the king from escaping. Now we have a mating attack with two knights and a rook. Believe it or not, knight gives a check. Knight gives another check. Rook gives a check, and it's mate coming up on the back rank. Once the rook goes in, we take with mate. We'll start with a bishop check. King into the corner. Blocking with the rook would not have helped. If this pawn wasn't here, the rook would swing across mate. So we'll tempt that pawn to move, or force it to move. Now we have mate with the bishop covering the escape square. Now we have a rather unusual mate coming up. Queen gives a check. Usually you check close to the king, but this time we'll move a bit further away. Queen box. Now sacrifice. King must take. And look at this for a checkmate. This I originally saw in the 1912 Modern Chess Primer. So black has a weak back rank. So we're going to start off by a sacrifice. Queen comes down. And now we have checkmate. And again, black is vulnerable on the H-file. White would love to get his queen into here, mate, so we'll get the queen there faster if we can get there with checks. So we'll start by sacrificing the rook. Queen checks, and now we get there. Using checks to get there. Okay, now we've got, what have we got here? So we've got two knights and a queen attacking two knights and a rook, but we'll start with a queen check, because that's a interesting sort of sacrifice. The knight goes in check, and now the king has to move, and now we have an absolutely amazing checkmate with four knights forming a square. Believe it or not, I've pulled this off in Blitz games. Okay, now a nice little queen sacrifice to force a smothered mate with knight and bishop. We'll sacrifice that queen. We'll give a check with the knight, and now the mate with the bishop. Okay, so we'll sacrifice our queen, and rather than going, oh, so it is that way. Okay, so there were two different ways of mating in two there. One was to take the G6 pawn, one was to take the F7 pawn. So we have a picture mate with knight and bishop. Okay, now this is a variation on the previous one, but we sacked the queen on a different square. And the knight's on a different square, so we have a double check. And that's the only move the king can go to, so we've got a choice of mating there or there. Now, looks like this square could mean an escape for the black king. So we'll sacrifice the knight. Now the queen covers that square. Now we can put the bishop in with check. Now we have mate. So here we want to sacrifice the queen, a bit like what we had before. This time we're not going to go here and here because the queen defends that square. So we're going to go double check, force the king to move, and we'll check on e7, mate on e7 instead. Okay, so now at some stage we want to stop the king slipping out here. So we'll start with a check. We'll play bishop check just to make black block that square, so now that will be mate. Okay, so what have we got here? So we've got we want to mate. We've want to threaten mate on this square, so we start with knight to f5, threatening mate. Now the g file's open. We'll give it a check with the rook. We've got a choice of mate on two different squares, there or there. Okay, so got a rook, a knight, and queen. This is looking a bit weak. We'll start with a sacrifice to break up the king. Move the queen in close to the king with check. And it didn't matter where the king went, we had a mate next move. So this is rather neat. Well, the knight's stopping the king from slipping out here, so we can check the king. Now we can sacrifice. Now we have a kind of a back rank mate with the knight stopping the king from escaping. Okay, so this is a fancy mate. We're going to end up mating on the h file. Give the knight a check, force the king in the corner. Sacrifice the queen to open up the h file, and we have a fantastic mate with the rook and the knight stopping the king from escaping. Okay, now got a bit of a weak back line here. In fact, that looks queen c8 looks like it wins quickly, but I believe the move is check. Bishop takes. We check on the diagonal, and now we have that would also be mate, but we can take the bishop with mate. Okay, so black's got the weak white squared around the king. We've got the three pieces attacking. We start by sacking the rook. Queen gets close to the king, and now we mate. The square looks like it's well defended, but white can take it. King takes would have allowed the queen in checkmate. Now we check on the back line. Now we've got a choice of mates in one. Check there, or we can go here, mate. The rook cannot block as it is pinned. Another example where we sacrifice the queen to follow up with a double check. King must move. Now we have mate. Another example where we break up the king's defences with a rook sacrifice. Then we get the pawn as well. Then we have a mate. The queen is defending this. I'd love to check here with the queen, so we'll start off by deflecting the black queen. We check on the diagonal. Now we've got the killer check with the bishop. And the queen can go in, but the queen will take it and be mate next move. So, black's got a pretty weak back rank. We'll check on the back rank. Destroy his defences with a queen sacrifice and follow up with mate. That's a rather fun one. We'll take this pawn with the bishop. If he'd taken it, the queen would take and mate. So now we can sacrifice the queen and mate on the h file with the bishop covering the escape squares. Okay, so now black's pretty weak on the white squares near the king, so I'll start with a mate threat. King tries to swap out, queen checks, and now we have a mate. And this one's pretty much the same. Queen threatens mate, we check, and then we mate. And we had that one, so check, check, and mate. Had that one. Okay, this is interesting. The black king position's been opened up by the pawns being doubled. So we'll start with a rook check to drive the king into the corner. Now sacrifice to open up the king. Now we get the very common mating pattern with the two rooks, but it's a bit more common to be on the edge of the board than on the side. Okay, so this one was based on a position on the front cover of a book called Winning Chess by Horowitz. So we start with a queen sacrifice. Bishop takes a knight check. We have a neat mate, two knights and a bishop. Okay, so yeah, we can sacrifice here. And when we take the pawn, the king is stuck on the h file and the rook moves over mate. So we've got bishops pointing towards the king. We've got a rook and a queen. So we open things up with a queen sacrifice. Now we've got a very fancy rook check because the pawn is pinned by the bishop to the king. King moves back and now we have mate in one. And similar to one we had before, the queen can take the bishop. The knight gives a discovered check. It's not a double check, but there was no way to block, so the king had to move anyway. Now we finish up with a mate with the knight. So black's got a weak back rank. White's got a rook and queen that could potentially get the back rank. We'll start with a knight check to open up the rook. And it didn't matter how black took. He's going to block something. So the queen moves down, which it couldn't do before because the black rook was guarding that square. Bishop goes back, and now we have mate. Okay, so bishop attacks the square near the king. Rook's on the same line as the king. Pawn may help to stop the king coming out. So rook opens up the king. The queen follows up with a check. Now we have a checkmate with queen, pawn and bishop. Now this knight's in the way of a check, so we'll sacrifice that. The rook takes, blocking the escape. Queen moves in check. And now we have a mate. So we'll open the king up with a bishop sacrifice. Queen gives a check, and it didn't matter if it came up, this move would still be mate. Okay, so a variation on a slightly earlier one we had. So black's king position has been weakened by the pawns being doubled. So we'll start with queen sacrifice. We'll give a discovered check. King moves, and now we'll give a check. And the queen can go in, but it doesn't really alter the fact that it's going to be mate. So we had that one. It's an interesting one. The bishop's attacking squares next to the king. Both bishops are lined up near the king. Once this pawn takes a pawn, the rook will be on an open file near the king. So white starts off with a queen sacrifice. Pawn takes pawn, double check. King must move. Now we have the mate. And yeah, that is the end of the section. So thank you for watching.